There's a strange irony in recording this episode because I know my audience. I know that most of you that are listening that have been here for some time are more than likely on the a little bit on the sharper edge of the gun culture. That may sound a little bit perhaps pretentious in some sense, but I know many of the people who listen to this episode are people who could not really be considered casual participants, but rather are well-intended and intentional individuals within the industry, within the culture. So the title of this episode might come across as a bit perturbing because of this attitude that can be observed in, well, at least a couple arenas, but might be the attitude of those who could be held responsible for many of the consequences that we face. See, we've all met the person who has the mentality of, I've got mine. And it's the attitude of somebody who approaches, whether it's their position within the military or a organization or a culture or a community or their reputation or their business or their place in history as somebody who simply has done what is required and can disappear off into, well, opulence. And the attitude manifests itself in a couple of different ways. You see this example in its kind of dark inversion whenever there's some sort of hyper urgency that arrives. It's an election year. It's 2020. People are rushing to the convenience store to buy toilet paper, or the gun stores are empty because everyone has to get their blank before it's banned. You see this attitude represented in military leadership who get their achievement. They acquire the rank of something. They get put in a position of responsibility. They're a commanding officer or a squad leader, or they earn their tab at Ranger School, and then they somehow go from what should be a rite of passage to some state of constant quitting. I've got mine, they say. I've got my combat deployments. I have my laurels and my titles and my AR-15 and my quad nods. Now my participation in this community is over. It's somehow different than retirement. There is something to be said about a person who puts in his time for years and years and years and comes to the time where he realizes that his torch must be passed on to another generation. What good he could have done, the time for that is past, but now it is his opportunity to set back from the position of king, commander, and leader and start functioning as sage and guide. But we've also encountered people who are unwilling to let go of the torch while simultaneously unwilling to participate and bear the responsibilities of that position. So this is a double-edged episode. It might come across as strange. Most of you that I know, or most of those who are listening that I know listen to this show, or most of the audience of this small podcast tends to be people who may not be suffering from this mentality, but might have to contend with it. See, this is an episode about not only the gun culture as a whole, but also whatever is going on in the West. It's this criticism and also encouragement for those who are willing to find motivation and put in the hard work to grow trees for those, grow the trees of which shade they will never experience. It's another example of one of those phrases, those turns of speech that we use to try to justify the validity of our position, even though we have no intent on seeing it through. That, of course, is the weakness of virtue signaling. And virtue signaling is the modus operandi, the common action, which is not a direct translation from the Latin, of what it means to live in our day and age. It is not good enough. It is not necessary that you be a thing. It is only that you bear its title. Or as somebody like Spiritus Systems has talked about it, is to be rather than to seem. The example of this that can be represented in philosophy are the people who try very hard to appear smart, but have no intention whatsoever to put in the work or contribute to what is meaningful when it comes to philosophy. You see this in the critical studies departments of academia, or in the never-ending billions wasted on entertaining the ideas of people who, if they didn't get their way, would resort to burning down their local economy just to say it didn't suit them enough. And so we'll begin with this. There's a section in Proverbs that states, Proverbs 25:6, do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, come up here, than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. That is somewhere to begin this or end this intro, and we'll continue to end this episode as we get into the second part. Now, this episode, if it doesn't break the energy too quickly, is sponsored by Obsidian Arms. And if you've been a part of the firearms industry, or you're familiar with much of what goes on here, whether it's competition or otherwise, there's a very good chance that you've encountered something made by them, even if it didn't have their name on it. See, Obsidian Arms is a manufacturer that not only can take your ideas and they can bring them to life, but they also sell a series of toolkits for those who are being interested in self-sufficiency, and some parts that address certain concerns that probably shouldn't be addressed on YouTube. But if you want to check them out, go over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com and thank them for sponsoring this show. So let's start with perhaps one of the most culturally egregious examples. Right now we are observing the aftermath of a hurricane unfold, which brings to light, for many of us, some of this urgency and concern from, well, the year 2020, where all of a sudden things like toilet paper and ammunition and bottled water were disappearing from all the stores quickly. And all of a sudden you had all these people rushing out who perhaps a day, a month, or a week earlier were mocking the prepared for being prepared. And they, in their panic, we set our entire economic system into a feeling of deadlock, which was only manifested further by government-enforced lockdowns. But the attitude of the individual who, exists in multiple parables, from Aesop to the Old Testament to even Greek and, various cultures of the ant and the grasshopper and so on and so forth, is really an easy person to criticize. It's the person who thinks, well, life is good now for me. It will always be good for me. And why should I have any level of self-sufficiency? And they abdicate all of their moral responsibility to the well-being of themselves, their family, and their community to some nebulous concept like the economy or the government or the state. And when those things buckle under the weight of responsibility, when the very same people who abdicate their individual responsibility vote in people who kowtow to their abdication, then we unsurprisingly see a, not double helix, but you see this kind of cause and effect creating a snake eating its own tail. The people who put the people in authority over them, who are the people who gave the least effort to the world, that lived the most selfishly in this arena, and then the people that they put in charge, catered to that weakness And then when the weakness of the government and the population collapsed under uncertainty and maybe even the consequences of their own actions, the people then suffer twice-fold, because not only are they responsible for the lack of responsibility they have portrayed in their own lives, but they kind of can be responsible for the culture and the society around them. See, political philosophers like to talk oftentimes about the rights of man and a properly ordered society and how one can function. They might talk about injustices done to the proletariat, or they might talk long about what are the proper functions of government. And these are good things for philosophers to do, especially those who are engaged in political philosophy, to answer questions like, what is the role of government? But then there's another entire way of looking at it, as the consequences of people's actions do manifest in their own government. See, if we actually believe, or we say that we are a government of, by, and for the people, then we, the people, are ultimately responsible for the types of governments that we put in charge of us. If we really are the people who believe in things like the Second Amendment or the right to bear arms, then we are responsible for the people who end up having some sort of, not necessarily say, but opportunity to infringe upon such things. It's easy enough to blame somebody else, but this dark example that we see in, whether it's leadership or within our world, particularly within the framework of the gun culture, of this attitude of I've got mine, is an interesting one, because it both claims virtue in the sense of self-sufficiency, or claims virtue by merit, but then just kind of lets the ball drop from there. You could think of some looming ban. Let's just take any sort of political ad and turn the dial well past 10 to, if you don't, the threat of whatever person becoming a president or a governor or a mayor or whatever, when they become blank, then your ability to buy blank will go away. Imagine that you saw an ad on YouTube or the television or whatever you wanted to call it. You got it in a magazine, you heard it from a podcaster like myself that said, well, if Kamala Harris becomes elected, then there certainly will be an assault weapons ban, and you won't be able to get an AR-15 or whatever, So then you go out and you buy yours. You find that level of urgency finally pushed you over the edge to go buy the thing, and then you sit back and you say, I got mine. I don't care if the ban comes through. It's not my problem anymore. They'll never find what I have. And so, you have this nice fictional world where the powers that be decide to institute something like an assault weapons ban, which is just a caricatured example of whatever the constituents of my political opponents prefer to purchase, that is what we're going to ban. Imagine you could look at the purchase history of automobiles, and you were saying, well, I'm a Republican, and Democrats more often than not buy X car, whatever car it is. So if we have these cultural motifs, we have these cultural commonalities, well, then why don't you just ban the car that your opponent likes to drive? Because then they won't be able to drive anywhere. Just go into power and say, you're not allowed to own this. This winding message is an attempt to illustrate how this mentality, this I've got mine mentality, is one of those things that you find both within the gun culture and within other communities as well, where once a person sort of gets the thing, then they quit. They're done. They're no longer participating. They're this mentality of getting in, checking the box, getting my rite of passage, and then quitting and letting the next generation figure it out for themselves, is this kind of odd mentality that you could also look within certain arenas. Now, you might imagine somebody who's in a position, he's in a team, he's already proved his worth, he's been accepted by the team and whatever. Imagine if somebody new comes in and they've passed selection, but they haven't proved their worth, but they say, well, I've got mine. I've got my tan beret, my green beret, my scroll, my tab, whatever it is. I've got mine. I don't need to prove myself anymore. In fact, I don't even need to contribute to the team. I don't need to contribute to the culture or the community or the participation. Sure, you might say that person accomplished the thing. They accomplished the tab, the task of getting their ranger tab, or the task of getting their thing. But once it came for them to pay back to their community, they were nowhere to be found. It's not good enough for our culture, in our gun culture, to view the limit of your worthiness to being something as what you own, or whether or not you got yours before the bad times arrived. We see this going back to the issues with the hurricanes. You've got multiple arguments. You could present perhaps a hierarchy of people, an hierarchy of the, depending on where you're from, how it's pronounced. I think hierarchy is technically correct, but hierarchy is how some others pronounce it anyway, whatever. You might have this hierarchy of people who, on the bottom, is the person who cares not, knows that he cares not, and believes it's everybody else's responsibility to take care of him. And then above him is the person who at least establishes some semblance of self-sufficiency. We saw this manifest multiple times in the early 2000s. Well, not even just the early 2000s, but it's especially into like 2010, 2011, maybe 13, 14. You had TV shows of doomsday preppers. And why was the doomsday prepper so unpalatable? It's because the entire manifestation of their life was selfish. Imagine doing this, right? You know, you see the dark times on the horizon, and you are no Noah. God hasn't called you to build an ark and save the animals. You are not trying to help the people. You're just there to go build your bunker in the woods, or your little farm where no one will bother you. And so you do that. You spend all this time and money and effort and energy building this metaphorical bunker out in the wilderness, and then sure enough, the hard times come and you successfully retreat with a 28 days later intro monologue or whatever, and you get to your bunker and you lock yourself inside, and outside of that is nothing. You survive for your 20 years and you finally crack the seal, like some sort of metaphorical Fallout game, only to find a thriving society outside of people who have done the work to regrow. Who are you to be there? And why should they ever accept you? In fact, what happens when you run into your old neighbors and gas station workers, and you find the old mayor or the old people who you used to live amongst, but you, abandoned to go live off in the woods, and now they've put in the years of suffering and perseverance to build the world back, and now you expect a seat at the table. You said, I got mine. I have my beans and bullets and bacon. I have my books and I have my isolation. That isolation was your grave. See, the way that we approach this attitude of I got mine manifests in multiple different ways. The boomer generation said I got mine when it came to the gun culture because they were satisfied with prohibition so long as it didn't affect them. They were satisfied with the banning of the bump stocks, or the overturning, not even the overturning, or the constant steady encroachment of the ATF and its what do you call it? Overindulgence. There's another word that I'm looking at. Maybe we'll call it it's gorging on the American population. Or the boomer generation is the generation that walks into the gun store and goes and buys 1,000 rounds of 5.56 and says, well, I got mine. It's not my problem anymore. And then people kind of chat around the campfire about stupid things like, well, when it goes down, we'll become raiders. And what a good way to give up OPSEC, dude. You know, what a good way to give up OPSEC. So just announce to your colleagues and those around you that you are the pillager. You are the bandit who is willing to forego morality for the sake of the convenience of another meal. Or you might moralize your way into war crimes and great evils because you've got to get yours. It's just about you. I've got mine. I don't care if they ban the bump stocks. I've got mine. I don't care if the government bans AR-15s. I've got mine buried in a box in my backyard. I've got mine. Who cares? I can't do anything about it. I'm just gonna sit back and get fat and happy on what I have. You're a team leader in a unit, and you get your tab. You go and you have your rank, and you've ascended to the level of commander. Even, let's just say you've reached the pinnacle of leadership in the military. Now you've got yours. I'm the commander. I've done the work. You're not interested in helping the men. You're not interested in foregoing, or you're not interested in furthering the mission, or readiness, or lethality, or the effectiveness. You're not interested in the well-being. You just are concerned so much about your own career and your own damn ego. What good are you to this culture? What good are you to your community? You've become a disgrace to the name. Because once you had the opportunity to say, here I am, send me, instead you said, I've got mine. Why should I try? Why should I put effort into this thing that doesn't thank me? Why should I dig the hole and plant the seed and water it and build the garden? Why should I tend the orchard and build the culture? Why should I participate? I've got mine. I've done my good. I've got my Instagram channel, or I've got my resentment, which keeps me warm at night. I've got mine. I've got my toys and tools, and I've got my culture or my community. True, you might have some of these things. But it's the question of, why are you there then? Why do you expect a seat at the table? If your mentality is, well, I've got mine. If your mentality is, I don't need to be, I don't need to prove myself. I don't need to carry the weight. I don't need to help the community. I don't need to offer myself. I do not need to say, here I am, send me. I just, want to be hailed as the hero without even considering to slay the dragon beforehand. You've quit. You've given up. See, the man if you want to boil this down to the simple morality of the disaster, you'll see people exhibit much more of their character. Perhaps this is why we like disaster films, and why we are entertained by post-apocalyptic dystopian novels, and why we are entertained by these stories where people build secret networks and save the slaves on the Underground Railroad, because we imagine in those simpler times morality would be much more simple. And yet, if we were to meet these people, we might actually find out that it wasn't that the time was simpler or more simple, but rather that they had courage, that they said, here I am, send me. They didn't have to have a perfect plan and a perfect kit and a perfect rifle and a perfect quad tube nod set up before they went out and said, where's the good that I can do? Let me find it and do it. These novels, these stories are inspiring. They inspire us because they're people who are being exhibited as those who chose to act when others didn't. Yet we juxtapose this with the way that we talk about our society when people will wake up. Okay, boomer. I know that's such a leftist phrase, but okay. Just tell me you've quit already. You've passed on the torch, or you're hoarding it. Bummer. You won't be remembered fondly. You'll just be remembered. So, when we come back to this phrase, do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, "Come up here," than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. There is a lesson to be learned here. There's a lesson to be learned here about how we look at ourselves as contributors in this community. How we look at ourselves in these times of disaster. Are we those who are the critics jeering at the political class, expecting them to dance like monkeys and correct our problems? Are we criticizing where the money is going and not actually paying attention to how it got there in the first place? Are we really just going to sit and complain and expect the greedy, cruel, corrupt people to one day go, "Oh no, I was corrupt. I shall stop"? No, none of these things are going to work. We know they're not going to work, but we're satisfied with griping and throwing a fit. It may be convenient to complain about the catastrophes that are happening on the East Coast. It might be convenient and perhaps a little cathartic to complain and say, look at the corruption. Look at how backwards it is. But while you do that, people die. They lose their houses. They lose their livelihoods. They're expected to find some way to recover. And we're happy saying, "I've got mine." We're happy saying, "I have my resentment towards a corrupt government." We're happy saying that our politicians are wasting our money or sending it away. We're happy watching our neighbors suffer and our young men commit suicide, and we're happy sitting around and saying, "Why should I try? Why should I try? I've got mine." And instead, you should be saying, or you could be saying, "Here I am, send me." This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Now go forth and conquer.